The Appalachian Trail runs for more than 2,100 miles along the spine of the eastern United States, threading through 14 states from the lowland heat of Georgia all the way to the wind-stripped granite summit of Katahdin in northern Maine. It passes through terrain that existed long before maps were drawn, long before the people who first drew those maps arrived, long before language had words for what moves through those mountains at certain hours. People have been walking this trail since its official completion in 1937, and in that time, the forest has absorbed an enormous number of stories, disappearances, encounters, events that were reported to park services and then quietly filed and never discussed again. Some of those events have come to us through personal accounts, through the testimony of people who had no reason to fabricate anything and every reason to stay silent. We have gathered the account you are about to hear from one such person. Their name has been changed, as have the specific mile markers and the precise section of trail on which this happened, because they asked us to do this, and because we believe that request is reasonable. They did not come to us seeking attention. They came to us because they needed someone to hear what happened without immediately explaining it away. What you are about to hear is based on a reported account. We have presented it as faithfully and as honestly as we are able. Whether you believe it is something only you can decide. Before we begin, if these kinds of accounts are something you find value in, if you understand that the world is older and stranger than our daylight hours, allow us to feel, please consider subscribing. It helps us find more of these stories and give them the space they deserve. His name, for our purposes, is Daniel Reyes. He was 34 years old when this happened. He lived in Asheville, North Carolina, and he worked as a wilderness survival instructor, which means he was not a casual hiker, not an enthusiastic amateur, not someone who had watched a few YouTube videos and bought good boots. He had spent the better part of a decade teaching other people how to read terrain, how to navigate without electronics, how to manage fear, how to conserve body heat, how to find water, how to make decisions when the body wants to panic and the mind needs to stay surgical. He was good at his work. He was, by his own admission, the kind of person who felt more competent in the backcountry than in most social situations. The wilderness was where he was best at being himself. He told us this not with arrogance, but with the plain matter-of-factness of someone describing a professional credential, the way a surgeon might say they are comfortable in an operating room. He had logged hundreds of solo nights in the backcountry across multiple states and had never had an experience he could not account for. He said that was important for us to understand before he told us what happened. He wanted us to know that he was not the kind of person to whom strange things happened. He had spent years cultivating the precise opposite of that kind of person. He was on a solo section hike, 11 days, approximately 140 miles of the trail in a section he had passed through twice before, on different trips, never for this duration and never alone. He had done the planning with his usual rigor, weather forecasts, checked against historical data for that elevation and that time of year, gear weight optimized and then re-optimized, resupply points identified and confirmed, emergency contacts updated. His sister in Raleigh had his itinerary, his expected check-in times at 2 road crossings where cell signal was reliable, and the name and number of the trailhead ranger station. He had a personal locator beacon clipped to the left shoulder strap of his pack. He had done everything correctly. He was not a man who cut corners in preparation, and this trip was no different. The first 4 days were, by his description, close to perfect. The weather held cool and dry. The leaves were past peak color, but had not yet dropped fully, and the light that came through them in the afternoon was the particular amber gold that you only get in late October at elevation, thick and slanted and almost physical, the kind of light that makes the ground look like it's been laid down by hand. The trail through this section moves through several distinct microenvironments, open exposed ridgelines, where the wind comes in sideways, and you can see 50 miles on a clear day, dense hemlock hollows, where the temperature drops 8 degrees in 100 yards, and the silence becomes a different quality of silence, rocky creek crossings, where the water is cold enough to make your hands ache, and long stretches of second-growth hardwood, where the understory is open and the walking is easy, and the mind goes quiet and ruminative. the way it only does in those specific conditions. Daniel loved this about the trail. He said it was like moving through a sequence of different worlds, each one complete in itself, each one asking something different of you. He had been looking forward to this trip for months. On the afternoon of the fourth day, maybe 2 hours before he intended to stop and make camp, he noticed something that he filed away without giving it weight. He was in a section of trail that ran along the western edge of a ridgeline, the slope dropping steeply to his left into a long, dark hollow that was already losing the light because of the ridge above it. The trail itself, still in full afternoon sun. He was moving at a comfortable pace, and his mind was doing what it does after several days in the backcountry, loosening from the habit of constant narration, settling into something more like observation without commentary. And then he noticed that the hollow below him was completely silent, not quiet, silent. There were no birds. There was no wind movement in the trees below. He could hear his own footfalls, his own breathing, the small rattle of something metal in the side pocket of his pack, but from the hollow nothing. He registered this, and then he registered that it was probably nothing, that hollows went quiet for all kinds of reasons. Temperature inversions, the passing of a hawk, simple chance. He kept moving. He did not stop. He did not turn around. He filed it and moved on. He told us later that this was the moment he would return to most often in the months afterward, not because it was frightening in itself, but because it was the first thing that did not fit, the first note that was slightly wrong in what had otherwise been a completely consistent piece of music. He made camp that evening at a designated site near a stream crossing flat ground. Good drainage. The stream audible but not close enough to muffle other sounds, which is something he paid attention to by habit. He made his food, hung his bear canister, read for an hour by headlamp, and slept without trouble. He told us he felt fine. He told us he woke the next morning feeling fine. He made coffee and checked his map and felt the particular cleanness that several days of physical effort and uncomplicated purpose produces in a person. And he set out. The first signal came mid-morning of the 5th day, and it came in the form of his compass. He used a base plate compass as a backup to his paper map navigation, not because he expected to need it on a well-marked trail, but because he taught compass navigation professionally, and carrying one was simply part of his identity as a backcountry traveler, the way a carpenter carries a square. He had taken it out of his chest pocket to confirm a bearing at a trail junction, a completely routine gesture, and the needle was behaving strangely, not dramatically, not spinning or reversing, nothing that alarming. It was hesitating. The needle would settle, and then when he turned slightly, instead of tracking smoothly, it would stick for a moment before adjusting, like something was dragging on it. He checked the compass for moisture, it was dry. He checked the housing for damage, it was fine. He moved away from the trail junction in case there was any buried metalwork from the old trail infrastructure, a rebar stake or a pipe, and tried again. The same slight hesitation. He stared at it for a moment. He was aware, in the clinical part of his mind, that certain geological formations could cause magnetic anomalies, iron-rich deposits in the rock, specific kinds of ore bodies that generated their own field. He was on the Appalachians, which were ancient mountains full of ancient rock. This was an entirely plausible explanation. He put the compass away and continued on the trail, which was clearly marked and which he had walked before, and he did not think about the compass again for several hours. But he noticed, without articulating it to himself clearly, that he did not take it out again that day. The morning of the 6th day brought the second incident, and this one was slightly harder to dismiss, though he managed it. He had woken before dawn, a habit, not an alarm, and was sitting outside his tent in the dark eating a cold breakfast, while he waited for enough light to pack efficiently, watching the forest come up out of darkness the way it does, shapes emerging first as suggestions, and then as themselves, the large boulder 20 yards from his tent becoming a boulder, and not simply a mass of slightly different darkness. It was in this emerging light that he saw the figure. He described it to us carefully. It was at the edge of the tree line, approximately 80 to 90 yards from where he was sitting, at the point where the campsite's cleared area gave way to the first rank of trees. He could not see detail. What he saw was a vertical shape, human in proportion, standing completely still. He looked at it for several seconds. He was aware of his own heartbeat accelerating. And then the light shifted by a fraction as the sky grew incrementally lighter, and the shape resolved itself into a tree, a slender beech with its pale gray bark, its remaining leaves pale and papery, standing slightly forward from the tree line in a way that, in the dark, had produced the silhouette of a standing person. He let out a long breath. He sat for a moment longer. He packed his camp and moved on. He told us he was 80% certain it had been the tree. He told us that 80% felt high enough that he was willing to accept it and stop thinking about it. He told us that the remaining 20% he simply did not examine. He pushed a longer day than planned, covering just over 18 miles, partly because the terrain was favorable, and partly, he admitted, because there was something in him that wanted to put distance between himself and that campsite. He did not name this impulse to himself at the time. He was moving efficiently, covering ground, doing the thing he was trained and experienced to do, and he felt competent. He felt the specific competence of a person who has identified an irrational feeling and chosen not to give it power. He camped that night near a shelter not in it, because he preferred his tent, but within sight of it, and there was a couple from Vermont camped inside the shelter, people he exchanged brief trail greetings with while filling his water filter, and their presence was uncomplicated and pleasant, and he ate his dinner listening to them laugh at something on one of their phones, and he felt the anxiety of the previous night dissolve almost completely. He slept well. He woke well. He felt foolish for the 20%. The third incident happened on the afternoon of the 7th day, and it was not dismissible. Or rather, he dismissed it, but it cost him something to do so, and he was aware of the cost. He was in the hemlock hollows now, the long shaded sections where the trail narrows and the canopy closes, and you lose the sky entirely. The temperature had dropped, and there was a quality to the air that felt old, the way cave air feels old, as if it had been sitting in the dark for longer than it should have. He was moving through a section where the trail bent through a series of shallow drainages, small seasonal streams now dry, their beds filled with dead leaves that made the going slightly slower and softer underfoot. He had been walking for about 40 minutes in this section when he heard the sound. He stopped immediately. He stood completely still. The sound was behind him and above him, somewhere on the slope to his right, which rose steeply from the trail through the hemlocks. What he heard was movement, not animal movement, not the crackling, irregular, directionless movement of a deer or a bear working through brush. This was rhythmic, footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with where he had been a moment before he stopped. When he stopped, the sound stopped. He waited 15 seconds. He counted them, 30 seconds. The forest was completely silent. He turned and looked up the slope. Hemlocks, shadow, the occasional pale shape of a birch trunk where the light found a gap. Nothing visible. He turned back toward the trail and took 3 slow steps forward. The sound resumed. He stopped again. It stopped again. He stood there for what he estimated was 2 full minutes, not moving, listening with the particular precision that his training had given him the ability to isolate a sound source, to track its position, to distinguish between categories of sound with genuine analytical skill. When he finally spoke aloud to himself, partly to whatever was on the slope above him, he said, in a voice that was steady and even, "Okay," just the one word. Then he turned and walked on at his normal pace. The sound did not resume. He walked for another 3 miles before he allowed himself to stop and sit on a rock beside the trail, and acknowledge that he was shaking slightly. Not much, just slightly. He ate something from his pack, drank some water, sat until the shaking stopped. He told us he convinced himself it was a hunter, even though the way the sound tracked him was not consistent with a hunter's movement, and even though he heard no other sounds, no voices, no equipment, no approach or departure, only that silence mirroring. He told us he chose the hunter explanation, not because it fit well, but because it fit at all, and fitting at all was sufficient for him to keep moving. That night he pushed past 2 good campsites and made camp later than was ideal, setting up his tent in the near dark at a site that was technically adequate, but exposed a flat area on the edge of a ridge, with no natural barrier on one side, open to the slope and to whatever was on it. He knew, even as he set up, that he had chosen this spot for reasons that were tactical and not rational, that a part of him wanted to see the approach if something approached, that the openness which made this spot less sheltered was also what made it feel slightly safer. He noted this about himself without approval or disapproval. He made no fire. He ate cold food and got into his tent and lay listening to the darkness for a long time before he slept. He woke at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the time because he checked his watch immediately and deliberately, an old habit from his training days when he taught students to note exact times when their senses triggered them awake. He lay still. He did not move. He did not turn on his headlamp. His tent was a single-walled Silent.On design, fairly taut, and in the moonlight that came through the fabric, there was a moon that night. He had noted its phase before sleeping. He could see the general shape of his immediate surroundings through the semi-transparent material, shadow and faint silver, the vague geometry of the world outside, reduced to suggestion. He lay still, and he listened, and he tried to understand what had woken him. There was no wind. There were no animal sounds. There was nothing that his ears could locate and categorize. But there was a smell. It came through the mesh of his tent's door vent, which he kept partially open for ventilation. It was a deep organic smell, wrong in a specific way that he struggled to describe to us, though he tried several times. He said it was not the smell of decay exactly, not carrion, not rot. It was older than that. It was the smell of something that lived outside the categories he had available for smell, something that had no analog in his experience. And what made it disturbing was precisely that. It was the smell of something his brain could not file, could not assign, could not recognize as either threat or neutral. And his body was making a threat response regardless, his heart rate elevated, his palms damp, every hair on his arms upright. He lay there for a long time. The smell faded gradually, the way a sound fades, diminishing in waves rather than cutting off cleanly. When it was gone, he lay for another 40 minutes before he accepted that he was not going to sleep again that night. And he sat up and turned on his headlamp at a low setting and sat in the red glow of it until the sky began to show gray at the edges. He did not allow himself to think about leaving the trail. He was aware of this decision as a decision rather than a default. He was a wilderness survival instructor. He had taught students to manage fear, to separate genuine danger signals from anxiety, to evaluate risk with a clear head. He ran that evaluation on himself, deliberately, the way he would have run it with a student. Nothing had touched him. Nothing had threatened him directly. He had heard sounds that were unusual and smelled something unidentifiable. In his professional framework, this did not constitute grounds to abandon a planned route. He acknowledged that this framework might not be adequate for whatever was happening. He acknowledged this and then proceeded on the route anyway. He told us later that he is not sure, even now, whether this was discipline or stubbornness or something darker, a refusal to admit that the vocabulary he had spent a decade building might not be the right vocabulary for this situation. He was 6 miles from the next road crossing, a county road where he knew he could get a signal and call his sister for his scheduled check-in. He decided to make that crossing his target and reassess there. He packed quickly, ate while he walked, and pushed hard through the morning. It was 3 miles from the road crossing that his headlamp failed. This is the detail that he circles back to most consistently when he tells this story, because it was the most mundane of all the things that happened, the least dramatic, but it was also the most consequential in the sequence, the thing that changed the conditions most materially. The lamp was not old. He had put fresh lithium batteries in it the night before the trip began, and lithium batteries in that lamp were rated for over 200 hours of use. He had been running it intermittently. It was his backup light, not his primary navigation tool in daylight, for perhaps 6 total hours across the 7 days of the trip. When it cut out completely and immediately, not dimming first, the way a battery issue presents, just there and then not there. The circuit interrupted, as if by a switch rather than a drain. He stopped. He opened the battery compartment. He checked the contacts. He reseated the batteries. He tried again. Nothing. He switched to his phone, which he carried for emergencies, and which he had kept in airplane mode to preserve battery. It turned on. The flashlight function worked. He continued toward the road crossing, 3 miles, and he told himself that a lamp failing was just a lamp failing, that equipment failed, that this meant nothing beyond itself. He was a mile from the crossing when his phone died. It showed 31% battery. He had been running only the flashlight, no other functions, and the phone was cold, but not dangerously cold. He had been carrying it in an interior pocket. It went from 31% to 0 in what felt like a single moment, the screen simply blanking, the flashlight extinguishing. He stopped in the middle of the trail. He stood in the sudden darkness. The forest around him was the mid-morning darkness of the hemlock hollow, deeply shadowed even in daylight, and without his light, he was in genuine low visibility, navigating by the pale line of the trail itself, against the darker ground of the forest floor. He stood still for a moment that was longer than he intended. Then he started moving again, faster, following the trail by instinct, and by the feel of the packed earth under his feet, and by the faint difference in density between the cleared corridor and the tree line on either side. He did not look behind him during this mile. He said this was a deliberate choice. He said he understood that this choice was not entirely rational, but that making it was what allowed him to keep moving forward rather than freezing. And he chose forward, the confrontation, because that is the word he used, and he used it with full awareness of what it implied, came at approximately half a mile from the road crossing, in a place where the trail exited the hemlock hollow through a narrow gap between 2 large boulders, and then descended a short rocky pitch toward a gap in the ridge. He came through the boulders and stopped. There was something on the trail ahead of him. He stood in the gap between the boulders and looked at it, and he was aware, with absolute clinical clarity, that his legs had stopped working. Not from a decision. They had simply stopped. His body had made its own assessment and had issued its own response, which was stillness, complete and involuntary. The deep atavistic stillness of an animal that has encountered something that falls outside the hierarchy of known things. What he saw was approximately 40 yards ahead on the trail between him and the rocky descent. He described it to us in multiple conversations and was consistent each time. It was large. It was not moving. It occupied a section of trail that was slightly wider than elsewhere, where the trail opened before the pitch, and it was in shadow, not because the light was bad exactly, but because it seemed to exist in a pocket of shadow that did not track with the surrounding light. He could not see its shape clearly. He could not tell us if it was bipedal or quadrupedal, crouching or standing. What he could tell us was its size, which he estimated at significantly larger than a bear. He had encountered bears on trail before and had a calibrated sense of their proportions. And this was larger, and that was not a casual judgment from a panicked man, but the evaluation of someone who, even in that moment, was attempting to observe accurately. It was not making sound. It was not moving. It was simply there, on the trail, in the direction he needed to go. And then he smelled it. The same smell from the tent, older than decay, outside his categories. The smell was coming from the direction of the shape on the trail, carrying to him on a slight movement of air down the pitch, and the smell was so immediate and so specific that it hit him like a physical pressure, and the combination of the smell and the shape and the distance between them produced in him something he described as the most complete fear he had ever experienced. Not the sharp fear of an obvious threat, but a deep, species-level fear. The fear that lives below language, below reason, the fear of something that your body recognizes even when your mind does not have the name for it. He stood frozen for what he estimated as 15 to 20 seconds, but which may have been longer. His hand was on the shoulder strap of his pack, near the personal locator beacon. He does not know when he put his hand there. He does not remember the decision. He was aware of the shape ahead of him, not moving, still in its pocket of wrong shadow, and he was aware of the slope rising behind him and on both sides, and he was aware that the gap between the boulders through which he had just come was the only exit behind him, and he was aware that going forward was not possible. And then, without consciously deciding to do it, he activated the beacon. He pressed the cover open and held the button for 5 seconds, and the device gave its confirmation pulse against his palm, and the GPS fix light came on steady, orange, and in that moment he began to move. He did not move toward the shape. He moved off trail, to his right, into the hemlock slope, moving laterally across the fall line, putting the boulders between himself and the trail as quickly as he could manage on steep, uneven terrain with no light. He moved quickly. He was not running. The slope was too steep and too cluttered with roots and exposed rock for running, but he was moving as fast as competent movement allowed, placing each foot with the minimum necessary care and taking the rest of that care and spending it on speed. He did not look back at the trail. He said this the same way he said he had not looked behind him during the final mile. Not quite a decision, more like the body's negotiation with what the mind could afford. He moved laterally for what he estimated was a quarter mile, until the hemlock slope gave way to a mixed forest section, and the terrain eased, and he could see through the trees a gray brightness that was the light at the road, crossing the gap in the canopy that a road makes, the open sky above it, the way it glows from inside a forest. He moved toward it. He fell once, badly, on a root he did not see, and landed on his right knee and the heel of his right hand, and was up again before he had fully registered the impact. He came out of the tree line onto the verge of the road and stood there in the daylight with the pavement in front of him and the forest behind him, and he stood there for some time, doing nothing but breathing. A pickup truck came by 15 minutes later and stopped. The driver, a retired school principal from the valley, a man whose morning was a routine drive to a hardware store, an entirely ordinary Tuesday, looked at Daniel standing on the verge with dried blood on his knee and his hand, and asked if he needed help. Daniel said yes. He got in. He asked to be driven to the nearest town with a cell signal. He made no attempt to explain, in the truck, what had happened. He said he had a fall. The retired principal said that the trail was rough and that people fell. He drove Daniel 23 minutes to a small town where Daniel called his sister and told her he was coming off trail early. She asked if he was all right. He said he had taken a fall but was otherwise fine. He did not, at that point, tell her anything else. The search and rescue team that responded to his beacon found nothing. This is not surprising. He had activated the beacon not because he was injured or lost, but because the sensation of pressing it and initiating a response had been, in that moment, the only action available to him that reconnected him to a world with other people in it, that reminded his nervous system that he was not entirely alone in a forest with something that had no name. The rangers who met him in town were professional and thorough and not unkind. They took his account, the location, the general description of the shape on the trail, his estimated size comparison. One of the rangers, a woman who had worked this section of trail for 11 years, listened to the full account without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was most likely a bear, possibly a large male, and that bear behavior in that section had been unusual that fall, that bears in the pre-hibernation period could behave unpredictably. She said this in the tone of a person providing an explanation, not dismissing a concern. Daniel thanked her. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had spent years teaching people to distinguish between large bears and other things, and that the shape on the trail was not a large bear, that he knew this, that his body had known this before his mind had formed the thought. The ranger's report noted the incident as a hiker distress activation at a GPS coordinate approximately a half-mile from the road crossing. It noted the subject's account of a large animal encounter. It noted that a trail crew check of the area the following morning found no animal sign, no tracks in the soft earth at the edge of the hollow, no scat, no disturbed vegetation consistent with a large animal's passage. This last detail was not included in any official communication to Daniel. He found it later, in a records request he filed 8 months after the incident. When he had finally decided he needed to look at the official documentation, he sat with that detail for a long time. No tracks, on soft earth, where something large had been standing on or adjacent to the trail. He went back to work 3 weeks after the trip. He taught a navigation course and a cold weather camping course, and by all accounts he was as skilled and as clear in his instruction as he had always been. His students would not have known anything had happened. He knows how to be professional. He is good at separating the parts of himself that need to function from the parts that are still working through something. His right knee healed from the fall. His hand healed. There was a period of about 6 weeks when he woke between 2 and 3 in the morning, not from nightmares exactly, but from a sudden and total alertness, fully conscious between one breath and the next, lying in the dark of his apartment in Asheville, listening to a city that does not go silent at any hour. During those weeks he noticed that he could not fully account for the smell in the tent that night, that when he tried to place it in any category from his experience, the category would not hold, that his memory of the smell was as complete and as immediate as his memory of any real sensory experience he had ever had, and that this completeness was in itself a kind of evidence. The smell did not fade the way a dream fades. It remained exact. He told us, in our final conversation with him, that he has not returned to that section of the trail. He has been on other sections. He is still a wilderness survival instructor. He still believes in the professional part of himself, in the principles he teaches, in the frameworks for understanding and managing the outdoors that he has spent a decade building. He does not believe those frameworks are wrong. He believes they are incomplete. He said this carefully, the way he says everything, with the measured precision of someone who understands that words have consequences. He said, "I think they account for most of what the backcountry contains. I think they are well built and largely sufficient. I think there is a remainder that they do not account for." He paused. He said, "I live in the remainder now." He told us one more thing, and he told us he was not sure why he was telling us this because he could not explain it. He said that in the month since the trip he had, on 3 separate occasions, caught the smell again, not in the forest, not in any outdoor space, once in a parking garage in downtown Asheville, once in the stairwell of the building where he works, once at 2:19 in the morning, 2 minutes after he woke from that particular depth of alertness, standing in his own kitchen with every light on, the smell present and immediate and older than any category he had available, lasting perhaps 40 seconds before it was gone. He stood there. He waited. It dissipated. He checked his doors and windows, which were locked. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table and watched the darkness outside his window until it became morning. He has told us he no longer checks the trail reports for that section. He has told us he no longer looks at the ranger station's public logs, which he was doing for months after the incident. He has told us he is trying, in the deliberate and disciplined way he does everything, to stop watching for something he cannot name, to stop expecting to hear, in some report or some record or some other person's account, the specific confirmation that what he encountered had a shape and a history and a territory and a reason for being where it was. He told us he believes he will not find that confirmation. He told us he is trying to make peace with that. He said this calmly. He said it the way he says everything, with the quiet authority of a person who is trying very hard to be honest about something that honesty alone cannot resolve. He still teaches. He still goes into the backcountry. He carries his personal locator beacon on the left shoulder strap of every pack he puts on, and he told us that the habit of keeping his hand near it, which he did not have before that October, is now permanent. He does not think about it consciously. His hand simply knows where the beacon is. He said this without drama, in the same tone in which he had described everything else, and we thanked him for speaking with us, and he nodded once, and he said he was glad someone was willing to listen without telling him what he had seen. He said that was all he had wanted, really, just that. We cannot tell you what was on the trail that morning, 40 yards ahead of a competent and experienced man in a hemlock hollow in the old Appalachians. We cannot tell you what produced that smell, or what moved parallel to him through the hemlocks on the 6th day, matching his pace, stopping when he stopped. We cannot tell you why the soil at that location showed no evidence of passage, or what was standing in the dark outside his campsite in the pre-dawn gray of the 5th morning, or why the silence of that hollow on the 4th afternoon had that specific quality of completeness, as if sound itself had decided not to be present. We can only tell you what he told us. We can only tell you that he is still there, in some sense that he cannot fully articulate, still in the remainder, still waking at certain hours, still keeping one hand near the beacon, still listening in kitchens at 2 in the morning for something that has no name in any framework he was given. The trail is still there. The hollow is still there. The old mountains are, as they have always been, largely indifferent to our attempts to understand what lives inside them. We think that is worth knowing. We think you would want to know.